Let's talk about a keto adaptive diet. You described earlier that it's something that you have to, as the name implies, adapt to. How does this affect performance?
Well, in the short term, performance will definitely suffer, and by in the short term I mean during the first 1 to 2 weeks, depending on how rapidly you adjust to it. But in the long term, it actually improves your aerobic efficiency because it frees you of the bond, effectively, of relying only on glycogen, which is where most people tend to live. They tend to prioritize burning glycogen over fat, and now we switch them to a spot where they prefer to burn fat anytime they are aerobically exercising. And remember, aerobic means exercising in a state where your cells have access to sufficient cellular oxygen. And what that allows you to do is spare your glycogen for those periods of exercise where you need rapid access to energy and you don't have the time to go through what we call oxidation. Now, there's a huge historical wealth of examples of people who have done pretty amazing things in a keto-adapted state. The Inuit probably provide the greatest example because obviously given where they live, they had no access to carbohydrates at all.
And where do the Inuit live?
So typically the Inuit live north of the tree line.
Okay.
So if you can imagine that for a moment, they don't have trees, they don't have grains, they don't have agriculture. They're historically living off animals, but primarily the blubber of the animal. So about 90% of their calories come from animal fat, 10% come from the protein of the animal.
Okay.
There was a very famous anthropologist from Harvard, Stefansson, who in the early 1900s went to live with the Inuit for a period of about 7 years. He wrote about it extensively and commented on how for the first 2 weeks he felt horrible and he couldn't pull a sled or do anything that he needed to do. But once he adapted, he said he felt better than he'd ever felt in his life. When he returned to Harvard in, I believe, 1915 and wrote about this in scientific publications, many people disputed this fact and said it was impossible that he could subside in this keto-adapted state for so long. While I wouldn't recommend anybody doing this, what he agreed to do was to be locked in a hospital for a year, a hospital in New York called Bellevue Hospital, for what is now referred to as the very famous Bellevue experiment, where for 1 year Professor Stefansson locked himself in the hospital and under 24-hour medical observation replicated his Inuit diet and was able to demonstrate not only that he wasn't harmed by this, but that he actually thrived as a result of it.
So when you talk about, we've talked about you kind of the oxidation process. From my perspective, it sounds like you're almost talking like a car, where your fat storages would be sort of your gas tank. You can kind of go for a while on that, and your stored glycogen is kind of what you have in the fuel line and maybe what you have in the engine. Is that a pretty good metaphor to use to describe
this?
That is.
I think that's a pretty accurate metaphor, which is if you never had any fuel primed in the line and you didn't have any glycogen, it would be hard for you to get going. But if you're talking about a long, sustained activity, something that's going to last an hour to 10 hours, it really makes sense for you to be burning fat. Conversely, if you're racing in the 50 fly, you're not going to be using fat for that race. You're going to be using glycogen.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.